Good morning. This morning we have a very special guest speaker, Dana Sawyer. Professor Dana Sawyer, as you may have remembered, spoke to us about a year ago. He is an associate professor of Asian religion and philosophy at the Maine, and I don't mean principal, but the state of Maine, College of Art, and an adjunct professor of Asian religion at the Bangor Theological Seminary. In addition, he teaches seminars on Asian religion and yoga practice at retreats hosted by Kripalu Center in Massachusetts and the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. He first traveled to India on a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to research the monastic structure and daily practices of the Dandi sannyasins. He returns to India frequently to continue his study of Indian spiritual practices. This morning, Professor Sawyer will speak to us on why the world needs Vedanta.
So what do you want to talk about? The name of this talk is The Value of Vedanta, and I want to begin by making a point about the value of thinking philosophically. In general, Vedanta is a system of philosophy, so a point about thinking philosophically in general. My wife and I do a lot of camping, a lot of backpacking. I don't ever feel like I'm getting away from it all. I feel like I'm getting away to it all. And we camp a lot with two friends from Port Arthur, Texas. And that's important to the story just because one time we were sitting by the fire, and one of these friends, Ernie, came up, and a group of us were sitting there, and he said, I want to know what's really going on. And I had an epiphany. You know, you have those where you kind of sit bolt upright, and you have like a shock, you know, an insight. And I thought, wow, I've been a philosopher for 30 years, and I feel the same way. I want to know what's really going on. Philosophers are people who don't only want to know what's going on, but what's really going on. Now, of course, a lot of people think nothing's going on, right? Maybe about 5 years ago, my wife and I were in Osaka, Japan, and we met some Brits, and we were sitting in a restaurant talking with these Brits, and one of them said, well, what do you do? And I said, oh, I teach philosophy. And he said, well, that's a waste of time. And I said, you think? And he said, yeah, it's like looking for rocking horse poop. There's nothing there. There's nothing to find. There is no meaning. There is no ultimate truth. So there isn't nothing really going on. They were there selling drill presses to Mitsubishi. I didn't think that was all that great either, but you know, anyway, that was what he says to me. So some people don't think anything is going on, and I often with undergraduates find that they have a resistance to philosophy based on that sort of a premise. I teach a lot of art students, and there will always be somebody sitting in the back of an intro to philosophy class fidgeting, you know, like philosophy. What am I taking philosophy for? I'm going to be a painter. I don't need to know anything about philosophy. And sooner or later, somebody in the class in the intro will pipe up, usually a male for some reason, and say, philosophy is a waste of time. And not realize that implicit in that statement is a value judgment, right? When you say philosophy is a waste of time, you're making a value judgment. And when I try to point out to them, well, then, would you say that in your philosophy is a waste of time? Then hopefully two or three of them catch it and understand what it means. Philosophy is fundamental, is my argument. It's far from being a waste of time, is implicit in everything a human being does. If we were going to follow you around with a clipboard, some anthropologist scrutinizing your behavior, then everything that you do every day is an expression of your philosophy. all of your behavior. You know, we're walking with a clipboard and you meet a dog. Do you pet it? Do you kick it? Do you ignore it? What do you eat? When do you eat it? How important is food in your life? These are all decisions we make, right? And these decisions are all based on our values. Aldous Huxley once said, "To the quote-unquote practical man, philosophical questions may seem irrelevant, but in fact, they are not. It is in the light of our beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality that we formulate our conceptions of right and wrong. And it is in the light of our conceptions of right and wrong that we frame all of our conduct, not only in the relations of private life, but also in the sphere of politics and economics. So far from being irrelevant, our metaphysical beliefs are the finally determining factor in all of our actions." So the choice, I argue with my students, is not whether or not to hold a philosophy or not. That part's inescapable. But whether or not to hold it consciously. Do you choose and embrace it? Or are you functioning out of what is probably largely cultural conditioning? You grew up in a certain place, in a certain context of family and culture, and you replicate that behavior out of cultural habit. Does that make sense? You do it because that's the way people do things where you live. That doesn't mean there's no philosophy there. It just means you're a puppet of one that pre-existed you and aren't making your own conscious choices. So I encourage my students to be proactive in choosing a worldview, to embrace their viewpoint consciously. What I find today teaching college students after all these years is that many of them are really starving for meaning, starving to find something that can produce some light, some hope, some change. We live in very cynical times. Have you noticed that? We live in very cynical times, and I find very often that my college undergrads are confusing what is really not much more than a gloomy mood for a complex philosophical position. I used to have a niece who, when she was 15, was still in my mind characterizes an attitude I see a lot in my undergrads, which is a cynicism. The entire philosophy is basically summed up in a posture, which is, you know, prove it, prove it. You know, whenever you say something that smacks of having any amount of idealism in it, as if, you know, prove it. You met anybody like that? Can you relate to that at all? Sometimes I see another mantra with my students, which is very much like that, and it is whatever, which isn't sort of a Zen ethos of, well, whatever change comes, I'm the still point in the middle of the hurricane. It's not that kind of whatever. It's like whatever happens is probably going to suck. And whatever happens, I'll have a cynical attitude toward it. Sometimes, you know, it's going by now. I'm happy to see that. But a phrase that was popular for a while, another one of these mantras was, if something good happened, the pronouncement was, well, that doesn't suck. Did you ever hear that one? Like you're surprised when something doesn't suck. And those are part of this attitude, this prevalent sort of gloomy mood that I'm talking about. Finding a kind of meaningfulness in meaninglessness. Finding meaninglessness meaningful. Cuddling up to it. Coddling it. Because if you don't get your hopes up, you can't be disappointed. And I often see that with my students. what they don't realize is, from a philosophical perspective, how parasitic a viewpoint it is. And what I mean by being parasitic is that you can't really be cynical in that particular way by yourself. You've got to have somebody's idealism to be denouncing. If you're alone on a deserted island, you know, who are you going to say, prove it to? You know, you need somebody there whose idealism you're shooting down. So it can be a fairly parasitic viewpoint. What I've realized is that they're afraid to get their hopes up in many ways, but they need to. And they feel a malaise from not embracing it. And certainly we as a culture need them to care. Desperately need them to care. I've seen them very strongly connect with ideas of Aldous Huxley. When you're teaching philosophy, you very often are spouting maxims from one philosopher or another. And students will come up after class and say, "What did you say? It started like this or that." And they'll say, "Wow, that's really a profound idea. You're really smart." And then you'll remind them that actually Aristotle said that, or Immanuel Kant said that, and you didn't in fact think it up. Very often a person, they'll come up after class and say, "Who said that?" is Aldous Huxley. And that's part of the reason that I wrote a spiritual biography of Aldous Huxley, was because they were finding so much meaning with his thinking. So much of his thinking, as many of you know, is based on Advaita Vedanta. So a lot of what they're connecting with in Huxley is in fact Vedanta. What I'd like to talk about is, for the next few minutes, is the fact that what's most attractive to them, to the students, is revealing of what Vedanta, what Huxley and Vedanta through Huxley have to offer. So let me talk about the value of Vedanta that my students connect with. We face a lot of problems today as a society and culture. I teach an environmental ethics course every other year. And when I teach the environmental ethics course, we start out at the place of listing some of what we're up against in terms of sustainability. What's preventing our culture from becoming a perpetual motion machine and surviving into the future? And so answers that I'll get to that question are things like pollution, species eradication, overpopulation, things that you've heard many, many times. When we make this great list on the board of all of these points, then I offer to them another viewpoint, which is that these aren't the problems, but in fact are only symptoms of a much deeper problem. And this is another idea that I'm borrowing. Lester Milbraith, in a book called Envisioning a Sustainable Society, is the first time I heard this theory launched, but Tom Hartman in his book Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight makes the same point. And basically it goes like this, that the problems we face as a society today are largely byproducts of our value system. That our cultural philosophy, if you will, the way we see things, every culture answers the fundamental questions of life, right? Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? What is the proper relationship between humans and other species? What is the proper relationship between humans and the planet? What is the proper relationship between the sexes? Every culture answers these questions and forms a value paradigm. So the argument that Hartman and Milbraith make is that so many of the problems we face in our world today are really just negative consequences of the answers that we've arrived at to those questions. Does that make sense? Can you follow the notion? They're not the problems, they're the symptoms of a deeper problem, which is our worldview. I'm thinking of a phrase from one of our great American philosophers, Lily Tomlin, who once called a culture's philosophy its collective hunch. Many of our problems that I see the students responding to grow out of a value in our culture today of profound materialism, a very deep and profound materialism. The idea that happiness comes through stuff. You've heard a lot about Vedanta. In Vedanta, the notion is that happiness is a function of being. And the culture is teaching that happiness is a function of having. And that discrepancy, Huxley's theory is creating a tremendous amount of sadness. Because Vedanta is arguing that the desire for stuff is infinite. The desiring is infinite. It won't go away. It won't stop. But everything you can own is finite. Everything you can buy at Walmart is limited in time and space. If everything you can own is finite, but the desiring is infinite, then you need to do the math. And if you do the math, then you'll realize that no matter how much you acquire, you'll always want one more thing. You know, Woody Allen once said, even when women do reach their ideal weight, 84 pounds, they're still too fat. And it's that sort of an idea. Even when we get everything, it still won't be enough. The desire will keep coming and coming and coming. I'll come back to that in a moment. Part of the reason that we're so deeply materialistic, I talked about when I was with you last year, and it relates to the fact that stuff can be quantified, and the value of stuff can be quantified by science. Do human beings need food? Well, we'll lock these doors, and we'll let some time go by. We'll perform a scientific experiment, and we'll find out whether humans need food or not. We'll probably find out they do. Do they need water? I need some right now, actually. If they do, we can quantify that. But can we quantify beauty? When you go to the art gallery, do you get 26.2 pounds of beauty? 32 lineal feet of beauty? Love, beauty, inner peace, inner truth. There's no way to quantify them. Because they can't be quantified, and we live in a culture that puts so much emphasis on the religion of science, then we tend to discard the things that can't be quantified. Qualitative experiences. What you get from music. What you get from art and spirituality. Those things can't be thrown out because they're about 90% of everything that life is love, beauty, peace, truth. Unfortunately, when we reduce what is valuable to only what we can quantify, we create a reductionism that herds us directly toward materialism. So avarice becomes a virtue. We create a culture in which excess equals success, in which a human being is identified primarily as a consumer. And what is the result? We're eroding an enormous amount of this planet's resources very quickly and not getting happy. Right now, over 20 million Americans are clinically depressed. Many more Americans than that are medicated for their unhappiness. Vedanta is arguing that inside of the body-mind, beyond anybody's body-mind, there is an ocean of being, Brahman, that is infinite, immutable, unchanging. That is the gift that keeps on giving. Because if you can possess infinity, it can satisfy infinitely. Only when we sit and reside in the middle, thank you. Only when we reside in the middle of that being do we have peace from that constant drive to possess, own, want. Nothing needs to be done to become happy. We're sitting in the middle of that ananda, bliss, that is at the center of being. And it's always there whether we're paying attention or not, right? That's the idea, is that it's here and it's now. I'll say something more about that in a minute, but I'm always trying to convince my students that deep down inside I'm really a very shallow person. And that's why, because the more you tune into that ananda, the closer to the surface it is, right? It's always there. So are you with it or not is the only question. Another arguable negative byproduct of our value paradigm in the culture right now is a very strong orientation not only towards stuff, but towards the future. The future of the three times, past, present, and future. The future, Huxley argued, has become the most valuable time for us in this culture. Values are interrelated, so our materialism goes with this concept of orientation to the future, because the future is when we're going to own all the stuff, right? We need time to acquire all the stuff. And when we get all that stuff, then we're going to be happy. We live in a culture with an extremely linear concept of time, right? There was Genesis, the universe was created. We're moving through time towards Armageddon in Judeo-Christian tradition. And in terms of our individual lives, we're born, we move through time, and we die. When I'm in India, it's always interesting for me to switch languages and speak in Hindi, because speaking in Hindi, there is a circular concept of time. So the word for yesterday, kal, is the same word as tomorrow, kal. The word for day before yesterday is parasom. The word for day after tomorrow, same word, parasom. So the future is always feeding into the past. And I notice speaking in Hindi that my orientation towards time changes. We have a linear concept of time. We're born, and then out here we die, and we're somewhere along that linear concept in the way our culture sees it. Let's put us right here. It feels good, towards the beginning, born time. Oh, we're right here. Plenty of time. One of the things that happens in our culture is that between where we are on the timeline and where we end up, there's this mysterious magical realm that I would call someday. It's always in front of you. You never catch up to it. No matter how this line moves, someday's always in front. Some days when you'll be happy. Some days when you'll have all the stuff. And we have a very heavy training in the culture for that. Recently I saw a New Yorker cartoon, and it was a BMW, and on the back windshield it had at the top Harvard MBA sticker. Underneath it said Amherst College. Underneath it said Eton, and underneath that it said Mother Goose Daycare. And what I liked about this pedigree on a windshield was that it's so indicative of the fact that before small children can even grasp the concept of the future, because the future only exists conceptually, the future doesn't actually exist, right? Whenever the future exists, we call that the present again. You understand? In philosophy, we would say it has no ontological viability. Onto is the Greek word for being, okay, existence. So it doesn't viably exist. It only exists as a concept, which probably explains why a tremendous amount of human cultures never thought of it. The Inuit the people that are often called Eskimos didn't have a concept of future and no future tense in their language. Many Native American groups never thought of the future because it doesn't actually exist. But for us it exists because we believe it so strongly mentally. We often say seeing is believing, but in reality believing is seeing, and I'll say something more about that in a moment. Believing is seeing. We believe in it so heavily. So when you're talking to a 5-year-old, you can have very complex conversations with a 4 or 5-year-old child, but perform an experiment next time you're around one. Start talking to them about the future. I remember when my daughter Emma, who's now 15, when she was about 3 or 4, I told her, my mother had called, and I told her we were going to go see her grandmother. She got so excited. She went in her bedroom and she started she had this panda bear backpack and she's jamming pajamas in it. She's getting excited. So I went in and I said, well, we're not going for 2 weeks. You don't have to get all prepared and packed. And she said, you said we were going. And I said, well, we are going. We will go in 2 weeks, And then the 2 weeks part becomes like in the Peanuts cartoon, whenever the adults are speaking, it's just wah, 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 wah. You don't know what it means, but you know that it's not going to go the way you want it to. So, then you start as an adult trying to say, well, we're going to eat 42 more times, we're going to sleep 14 more times, and then that's wah, 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 wah. You see my point? Long before a child can grasp the concept of the future, we're bludgeoning them with the need to be future-oriented. Why do you go to school? You go to school, why do you go to elementary school? So you can go to high school. Why do you go to high school? So you can go to college. Why do you go to college? So you can get a good job. You're thinking about a good job in Mother Goose daycare. You're already on the track to this bright and beautiful someday. But what can be scary about that is that you buy so strongly into the future that you never catch up to someday. You're in junior high school, and if you're a boy, you got one arm longer than the other, your voice keeps cracking and breaking, and you think, oh boy, it's going to be so great when I get to high school. And my voice deepens, and my acne goes away, and so you want to go to high school, and you get to high school, you're going to be able to drive. You get to high school, of course, and then your parents won't let you use the car. The girls or boys still don't like you. And then you think, well, when I go to college, that's when I'll be happy. I'll be so happy when I go to college. I get a college education and everything. Get away from my parents, get out from underneath the thumb of mom and dad. And then you get to college and nobody's doing your laundry for you anymore. You can't borrow the car and you can't afford a car. You understand what I'm saying? This can go on if you're not careful, because then you can think, well, when I get out of college, I get a real job, and that's going to be great. Working all the time, making money, that's going to be great. I'll get married. And then you get married and get a job, and then, I'm going to be so happy when I get divorced, and I'm going to, it doesn't stop. You just keep chasing someday ad infinitum, like a mule chasing a carrot. Vedanta is very good therapy for that, because it herds you very strongly toward the now. Because Brahman, Atman, the deep self, is always only existing in the now. It doesn't exist in the past. It doesn't exist in the future. It exists in a timeless, eternal now. So orienting yourself toward Brahman implicitly means orienting yourself to being present. Too often the now is only a stepping stone to someday. I think that's one of the reasons actually I like going to India so much. It's a good cure for future orientation disease, dis-ease, because in the United States, things function quite efficiently in many cases, And that creates a situation in which we are disappointed to be present. What I mean by that is my wife and I live close to a very large bridge. We live on the ocean in Maine, and there's a big bridge there. And people come across the bridge every morning into the city to work. And the harbor master has a funny little joke he plays with some regularity, and that is during rush hour, he likes to put the bridge up. So when he puts the bridge up, they can't, their plans are stymied. Their schedule is thrown off, and Americans don't like that, I find. You know, having a flat tire on the way to work wasn't scheduled into the day, and being sentenced into the present can be horrifying, right? It's schedule, it's next, next, next. So these people will be fuming, sitting on the bridge, fuming that this bridge is up, and they can't keep to their schedule. And the sad part about that is they're sitting on a bridge overlooking a beautiful stretch of the Atlantic Ocean. And how ironic to be in this position where somebody's giving you a present, the present of the present, to sit and look at this beautiful expanse of ocean, and instead you're only drumming your fingers and you're angry that you have to be in that place. So India is good cultural therapy, because very often things don't run that efficiently, and you have to surrender. And surrender can be good. One time I was in a place called Rishikesh, and I was trying to go up to the source of the Ganges River at Gangotri. And we had been waiting for, the monsoon had washed the roads out, and we had been waiting for them to rebuild the road before we could take the bus to go up to Gangotri, which is about a 14-hour ride. It isn't very far, maybe 160 miles, but it takes a very long time to get there. Anyway, long story short, we got in the bus. Finally, we were so excited we're going to be in Gangotri tonight. This will be great. And these two friends of mine and I are going up the road. We got about 3/4 of the way to Gangotri. Road was washed out. Had washed out after we left. The bus driver says, okay, we've got to go back. We've got to go back to Rishikesh. Okay, well, we'll wait some more. We turn around, we drive about 1/3 of the way back to Rishikesh. Road's washed out behind us too. So now we have to live there for a while. So now we're stuck in this little village. And one of the wonderful parts about it was how quickly and easily the Indians on the bus accepted it. You know? They got pots and pans out, and now they're there. You know, it was a big windfall for the villagers, lots of rice and dal to sell. And it was more of a challenge for Americans, but one that was good to embrace, that kind of surrender, to let that be enough, to be there and be in that present. Does that make sense? You with me on that? On the one of the things that's so wonderful about Vedanta is that if you embrace it as something more than just ideas, if you're embracing it experientially, is the orientation toward the present. One of the last package of negative byproducts, I'm describing them as, negative byproducts of our worldview relates to our assumptions regarding the nature of consciousness itself, human awareness, human experience. One place to start with that is in our culture, in Western culture, the assumption is that consciousness is fixed, that consciousness isn't a variable, that the awareness in your head and mine and everybody's head is quantitatively, qualitatively the same thing. It's a very exciting idea, and I see the excitement in my students' faces. I teach a course called Potentials of Human Consciousness, a title that Aldous Huxley himself actually suggested in a talk he gave here. In Potentials of Human Consciousness, we talk about the idea, well, what if Hindus and Buddhists are right? What if consciousness, in fact, is a variable? You can have more consciousness, deeper consciousness, richer consciousness, a more authentic level of consciousness. We come into a room and we turn the lights on. I can see a light switch over there. Westerners have for a very long time assumed that human consciousness is like that light switch, on, off. You wake up in the morning, on. Go to sleep at night, off. Somebody hits you in the head with a pipe, off. But what if consciousness is more like a rheostat switch? You can turn the lights on and then up. What if consciousness is a variable? That's an extremely, extremely exciting idea. In this sort of suspicious, cynical state of mind that a lot of my undergraduate students have, they're attracted to the idea of a spiritual viewpoint based on direct experience. I'm not asking you to accept this on faith. I'm saying, see if you can't turn up your own light switch, and then you tell me if consciousness isn't a variable. That's what yoga is for, right? That's what meditation is for, that exact phenomenon, turning up the lights. Huxley once described himself as a mystical existentialist. It's a cumbersome name. But what he meant was an existentialist is somebody who wants to reduce their philosophical viewpoint to only what they directly experience. So, is there a God? No. Are there chandeliers? Yes. That an existentialist is a person who's saying the foundation of my viewpoint is what I directly experience. But the assumption for most existentialists in Western philosophy has been that since consciousness is fixed, not a variable, experience is fixed. Do you understand? There isn't a hierarchy of insight in experience. There's only one possibility for the human being. What if experience can be modified, deepened, enriched, made more authentic? It's an extremely exciting idea. The way I try to communicate it to my students is, imagine there are 3 climbers climbing on a mountain. And all 3 of these mountain climbers are in radio communication with a base camp. One of them is about halfway up the mountain, below the tree line, in the trees. One is at the tree line, and one is standing on the summit. And the philosophical question, the analogy for the philosophical question that comes out of the base camp is, what is it like on the mountain? So what is it like in life? And the person about halfway up in the trees says, it sucks. It's hot. There's lots of bugs. There's no breeze. I can't find the path. There's all this dense overgrowth and blowdowns. The person at tree line, overhearing this comment, tries to measure it against their own direct experience and is looking around and says, no, it's sort of like that, but in one direction I do have an open view and there are no bugs and there's a little bit of a breeze. The person at the top says, well, I can see 360 degrees. It's a beautiful view. No trees or bugs at all. Who's right? They're all right. They're all reporting directly what they're experiencing, but they're wrongly assuming that they should all be experiencing the same thing. Do you understand? In other words, it's this idea that consciousness can be deepened, enriched, opened in powerful, meaningful ways. So the Buddha, maybe in that analogy, is standing on the peak. Shankara standing on the peak. That idea is very exciting to the students, that they wouldn't have to back off from this idea that spirituality should be deeply grounded in what we directly experience, but that there are possibilities beyond what I'm experiencing at this particular moment. That's very exciting to them. Another and last idea relative to these assumptions about consciousness is one that I find particularly intriguing. It deals with an idea that has been in our culture for a very long time and is also found in lots of other cultures, and that is that perception is passive. Perception, in fact, is not passive. From Aristotle through Descartes all the way to the 19th century in Western philosophy, we find an assumption that human perception works like a family camcorder. That when I open my eyelids, my lens covers, I take in the world in the way that a camcorder does. And my ears are microphones that take in the world the way the microphone and the camcorder does. In fact, that's not a good analogy. Perception doesn't work like that. What happens is we're constantly bombarded by thousands and thousands and thousands of perceptual stimuli. Right now, if you were going to make a list of everything you can see, every object, every color, every texture, every amount, how long a list would that become? Just everything that's in front of your eyes at this moment. It would be enormous. And that's only what is available to you visually. We can hear things. You can hear me speaking. If you were closer, you could hear my stomach grumbling. I didn't eat enough breakfast today. We can hear people moving in their seats. We could hear traffic outside. And we can feel things. All these stimuli are available at every moment. Are you aware of them all at every moment? We can do a lab experiment for this lecture today. Right now you can feel your butt on the seat. The sensation of it is there, right? It's a stimuli. It can be paid attention to, but were you aware of it before I suggested it? Probably not. And the reason is that perception happens on the basis of a tremendous amount of selection of stimuli. From the stimuli that bombard us moment to moment to moment, we're constantly and mostly pre-consciously choosing the important ones to pay attention to. I put important in quotation marks because there's a profound philosophical question involved there, and that is, who says they're important? You understand? Of all stimuli available to you at every moment, you're selecting, again, mostly pre-consciously, which ones to pay attention to, and most of those choices have formed out of habit. Either perceptual habits that you have inherited from your culture, which is true in many, many, many cases, many more than most people are aware of, or the ones you've built up in the habits of your own life and your own existence. Human beings tend to be robotic. I notice with students, they come in and they sit down in a classroom. And by the third class, they've figured out where their seat is, and they'll always sit there, class after class after class. The guy beside them didn't bite them last time they sat there. Seemed like a safe place. And so they'll go to that place. We're creatures of enormous, enormous, enormous habit. Our culture wants us to survive. All creatures need to survive in their environment. We're creatures of what is largely an artificial environment, artificial in the sense of humanly created. I was reading a Vanity Fair article a few years ago that gave statistics about the amount of time that Americans spend outside. Not in some Yosemite National Forest, but just not inside a car or a building. What percentage of Americans' lives are spent outside? 2% of their entire life is spent not in a building or not in a car. So we're creatures of an artificial world, and we survive inside that artificial world. So what do we know how to do? Use an ATM machine, drive a car, program a VCR, use a computer, get our email. These are our survival skills. And they are important relative to that particular environment that we live in. But very often this deep acculturation to keep replicating a very specific kinds of behavior blinds us to other possibilities of consciousness and perception. Edmund Husserl, a 19th century philosopher who is really the first person in the Western tradition, this is very old in Indian tradition, but the first person in Western tradition to suggest that perception is not passive, but that we're choosing all the time. He made up a phony baloney deck of cards and used to play cards with his friends. And he would deal them a card and he'd say, "Oh, by the way, what was that card I just dealt you?" His friend would look down at it and say, "Ace of Hearts." He'd say, "You sure? Take another look at it." They'd look at it. "Yeah, it's the Ace of Hearts." He'd say, "Well, actually, if you look more closely, that's a red Ace of Spades." And his friend would say, "There is no red Ace of Spades." And Husserl would say, "There's one. There's one right there." And the point he was trying to make is that our conditioning becomes a kind of cognitive blindness. It predisposes what we see and what we tune into. So we can't see a red Ace of Spades when it's right there because it doesn't exist conceptually, you understand? We're still responding robotically out of what we know the world to be. That knowledge is dangerous because it's filled with assumptions about what the world can be. It doesn't allow it to be something else. Relative to this business about the now I was mentioning a moment ago, one time my daughters and I were walking to school when they were about 4 and 6. And it was springtime, and that's a joyous occasion in Maine, I gotta tell you. And we're walking to school, and down a side street, there were all these beautiful flowers. And my daughter Sophie said, "Can we go this way? Can we go this way?" And I said, "Well, this way is quicker." And she said, "Are we in a hurry?" And she didn't say it ironically. She was 6 years old. And then I thought, well, of course, we're always in a hurry, right? I mean, that's a default mode for a person in our culture today. And then I realized, you know what? We aren't in a hurry. We're rushing out of habit. And we do have time to go down the street. And we do have time to see these beautiful flowers. And we do have time to be present as a family and enjoy this moment. So taking that chance to break free of that robotic predisposition, I say to my students, we don't see the world. We see the world we're conditioned to see. If somebody's wearing green sunglasses, they can make the wrong assumption that everything in the world is green. If you're acculturated in our present culture, you can make the wrong assumption that you're seeing it as it is instead of through a lens of conditioning. I tell my students that I think one of the reasons we're consistently seeing a theme in our popular culture of things like the fear or danger or the scary guys, the bad guys, or a scary situation characterized as the Borg on Star Trek, The Next Generation, this Borg collective where everybody's a cell in the body of a giant machine. Nobody thinks individually or for themselves. The Matrix series of films where human beings are being fed directly into their cortex reality and have no contact with reality beyond those illusions. I think what's so terrifying about those images for us is that they're true. That living inside of an artificial reality as much as we do, and having such strong directives to see the world in only one way. Good little boys do this. Good little girls do this. That something inside of us wants to transcend that longs for transcendence. But too often the transcendence manifests there's an awareness that there's some sort of consensus trance that we're all reinforcing in each other. But the attempts to transcend it very often are sort of unfortunate flailings, drugs, overstimulation of various different kinds, alcohol addiction, a desire to transcend self, but no real apparatus for doing that. Aldous Huxley used to call these horizontal transcendences instead of vertical transcendences to the sacred. I see that very strongly with a lot of my students. Changing sexual partners very regularly, not establishing any deep relationship, not understanding why that doesn't work, feeling frustrated about it, seeking more horizontal transcendence through drugs, not getting satisfied. Can you relate to that? Do you know anybody who's like that, or you see it in the culture yourself? I think this idea that is so enticing to me in Vedanta and always has been. By the way, I was introduced to the thinking of Aldous Huxley and Vedanta in the same month. In the fall of 1969, I was taking an Intro to Philosophy class in which we read Brave New World. And that same month, I happened to be in Meeker's Hardware store in Danbury, Connecticut, and met Swami Satchidananda. I was in Meeker's Hardware store on White Street in Danbury, Connecticut, and Swami Satchidananda was standing there. I had never seen a man wearing a dress before, coming from Maine. And so he's standing there with long hair, which was no shock because it was the 60s, and I had long hair too. But he says to me, do you know I have only just now gotten a speeding ticket? I was like, no, I didn't know that. He goes, I said, Mr. Cop, you know, if you don't want me to go fast, why call this car Thunderbird? Why don't you call it tortoise or snail? All the time, the car is Mustang, Cougar, it wants to go fast. So I'm thinking, wow, this guy. So maybe that was my first lesson in Vedanta. I started doing meditation with Swami Satchidananda that fall in 1969, and that was my introduction to those ideas. But what I found so lovely and still do philosophically about the ideas of Vedanta is this notion that ultimately truth is experiential and transcends all thoughts, all conditioning, all ideas. Even the ideas that are part of the philosophical system of Vedanta have a limited value. The idea of a cake is something, but a cake is something more. The idea of enlightenment is something, but moving toward that experientially is the goal. That the ideas are just a guide along the way, and in many ways, ideas are something to be let go of. In a sense, there's something in Vedanta that's as much about forgetting as it is about learning. It's not about conditioning yourself to see the world from a quote-unquote enlightened perspective. It's about tuning into something in you that is much deeper than mind, much deeper than thoughts. In the Western philosophical tradition, truth has always been conceived of as a thought. One day, some really smart guy or gal is going to think up the P-star thought, you know, like, that's what I call it, the profound star thought, and that'll be truth. I've always been very attracted to this idea in Hinduism and Buddhism that truth is a condition of being, a condition of experience, and I find my students also are deeply attracted to that. So to end, talking about this self beyond mind and all other boundaries, Huxley once said, the only hope for the world of time lies in being constantly drenched in that which lies beyond time. Drenched in that being. Houston Smith, another friend of the Vedanta Society, once said, "Every emptiness we feel is ultimate being eclipsed. All restlessness is a flailing for the being that we need, and all joy the evidence of being found." In the Advaitin tradition of Shankara, when the lineage of masters is invoked, it always begins with a prayer, a short prayer that goes, "Apavitra pavitro va savavastanga topiva yasmaret pundari kaksham sabayabhyantara shuchi," which means whether pure or impure, whether all places are permeated by purity or impurity, whoever opens themselves to the expanded experience of unbounded consciousness gains inner and outer purity. That's the promise of Vedanta. And very often I see with my students some hope come from that message. The possibility of change, of growth, transcendence of the consensus trance. But anyway, prayer is a good place to end, I think. So we'll end there. Thank you very much.